right, Tom? 3 years ago, Captain B.J. Armstrong. And really it's there to develop our understanding, collective understanding of the naval past, and encourage collaboration with other fields in Seapower studies. Stockdale Center and FINHSS would like to thank William C. Stuck, USNA class of 1949, for his generous donation. It supports the lecture series and the support of the Naval Academy Foundation overall. I want to take a moment to thank Colonel Reed and Curtis for giving us the opportunity to use the art room here for the School of Humanities, for hosting us here this year for our First Barbary lecture series, as well as Matt and his team, MSC, set these up, get this on video so we can post it for posterity, and for those who couldn't be here, we can put this on our website. Today, we're joined by Dr. Abby Mullen from the History Department. She's an assistant professor here at the Naval Academy. She teaches naval history, maritime history, and historical methods in the History Department. Her research focuses on early American naval and diplomatic services. She's written about the Quasi-War and the U.S. Consular Service, but her main focus is the First Barbary War. Her monograph on that topic, To Fix a National Character, just been released, strategically placed. Fix the National Character, the United States in the First Barbary War, 1800-1805, was released in August and published by Johns Hopkins University Press. Today, her book is on that talk. Her talk today is on the book, and it's entitled A Secret Expedition, the Burning of the USS Philadelphia in the First Barbary War. Dr. Mullen.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for your flexibility. I know this is sort of more rushed than we were going for, but that's okay. So yeah, let's talk about a secret expedition. On the evening of February 16th, 1804, a small ketch sailed into Tripoli Harbor and pulled up next to the USS Philadelphia. The Philadelphia had been in Tripoli Harbor since November of 1803, captive to the Bashaw of Tripoli. Its officers and crew were imprisoned on the shore, and a crew of Tripolitan guards maintained the frigate. The pilot on board the ketch called out to the guards. He asked if they could tie up next to the Philadelphia because they had lost their anchors on the way into the harbor. The guards assented. The ketch tied up, and before the guards could realize what was going on, a group of about 70 men swarmed over the sides of the ketch onto the Philadelphia. They overcame the guards, killing about 20 of them, maybe. Then they set explosive charges throughout the ship. The captain of the expedition, Lieutenant Stephen Decatur, stayed on board until there were flames leaping through the hatchways, and then he got off, thankfully. As the ketch pulled away from the burning frigate, the tops and the rigging ignited. And miles away, the USS Siren's crew could see the flames leaping into the night. It was the end of the USS Philadelphia. If you don't know much about the First Barbary War, this is probably one of the two things you do know about. The other one is, of course, the famous march across the shores of Tripoli by 7 Marines plus 1,000 other soldiers, and they're going across the desert of North Africa towards the city of Derna. Very famous event from the First Barbary War. I'm giving a library talk in the spring. Maybe I'll talk about that one for the library talk, and then you can get both sides of this story. The burning of the Philadelphia always comes with lots of heroics, but I'm sort of famously known for not caring about heroics and daring do and swashbuckling. So instead, I don't want to tell you about any of that stuff. I want to tell you about some of the other decisions that were made that made the burning of the Philadelphia possible. And hopefully, because this is the Stockdale Center's thing, we're going to draw some lessons about leadership along the way. Each decision we're going to talk about was made by a different person, or principally by a different person. So no one person orchestrated the Philadelphia's loss or its subsequent destruction. Instead, all of these individual choices affected many more people than just the people involved in that particular incident. So to understand how all these choices fit together, we need to back up to before the Philadelphia was captured. Oh, one word about the slides here. And whenever it has been possible, I've tried to use images that belong to our very own Naval Academy Museum. So I would very highly recommend that you take a jaunt over there to look at the museum's collection about the First Barbary War. Not today, it's closed on Tuesdays. But check out all the great stuff that they have there, and I've labeled them with USNA Museum if they're coming from the museum, so you can kind of know what's available. Okay, so let's do a really quick recap of the war. The Bashaw, or ruler of Tripoli, declared war against the United States on May 14, 1801. He was unhappy that the Americans had not treated him like his brother ruler the day of Algiers, and the American consul, whose name was James Leander Cathcart, could not convince him that this was not worth going to war over. So over the course of about 4 years, the United States sent 4 squadrons to the Mediterranean, each one under a different commodore. These commodores used a variety of strategies to try to bring the Bashaw to terms, from blockade to bombardment, and then ultimately to the threat of regime change. Finally, in June of 1805, the United States was able to sign a treaty that returned the Philadelphia prisoners to the United States and established peace for the low, low price of $60,000. Okay, so that's the broad strokes of the war. Everybody clear? We're good? Good, excellent. Okay, we're gonna pick up our story then in the middle of 1803. The Secretary of the Navy, Robert Smith, is preparing the 3rd Squadron to sail to the Mediterranean. So here we need to talk about force construction. Our first lesson is this: learn from the people who have experience. The Philadelphia was the 2nd largest ship in this 3rd Squadron, smaller than only the USS Constitution. The other 5 ships in the squadron were schooners and brigs, much smaller vessels with much shallower drafts. These smaller ships were a deliberate choice. They were needed because the waters around Tripoli were notoriously shallow and difficult to navigate in bigger vessels. The Philadelphia, of course, learned this at her peril. Ironically, though, the captain of the Philadelphia was the reason that this squadron was made up mostly of these smaller vessels. William Bainbridge had served in the 1st Squadron in 1801. He had been there when the first Commodore had initiated the blockade. When he returned to the United States in 1802, Secretary Smith asked him what kind of vessels he thought would be most effective to maintain the blockade against Tripoli. Bainbridge emphasized the need for smaller vessels that could go in closer to Tripoli. Without a tight net, the blockade was basically useless. So, whereas the 1st Squadron was 3 frigates and a schooner, by the time we get to this 3rd Squadron, Secretary Smith has weighted that squadron towards these smaller and more agile vessels. The Commodore of that 3rd Squadron, Edward Preble, recognized the value of those smaller vessels as well. After the Philadelphia's capture, the blockading American squadron captured a small Ottoman ketch in December 1803. Preble immediately saw its value as a flexible combatant, but he also recognized that its appearance might allow the Americans to get close into Tripoli harbor, perhaps close enough to do something about the Philadelphia. That ketch was named the Mastico. Preble renamed it the Intrepid and brought it into the fleet. He, along with Secretary Smith, listened to the people who had experience and used their knowledge to support the mission. And this leads us to lesson number 2. Know who and where your enemy is. Not the enemy. When the 3rd Squadron arrived in the Mediterranean in September of 1803, they encountered a very unwelcome surprise. During the tenure of the previous Commodore, the Emperor of Morocco had actually declared war on the United States, very briefly. The Commodore at that time, Richard Valentine Morris, had mostly gotten things worked out. But when Preble arrived, he learned that there were Moroccan ships sailing around the Strait of Gibraltar with orders to hunt for Americans. Morris had chosen to spend a lot of time placating Morocco instead of going to Tripoli. Preble saw the sense in that, because keeping the Strait of Gibraltar clear for Americans clearly was a priority. However, he, unlike Morris, remembered that the United States was actually at war with Tripoli. So he stayed in Morocco himself to work out all of this mess, but he sent ahead of him 2 ships, lest, as he said, the Tripolines would be induced to think we neglected them. This decision proved to be fateful, but that doesn't mean it was the wrong decision. It took until October 10th for Preble to establish lasting peace with Morocco. The early fall was prime cruising season for Barbary corsairs, for Tripolitan corsairs. The blockade, because Morris had spent so much time in Morocco, had lapsed under Commodore Morris, and Preble determined that it needed to be reestablished immediately. He sent those 2 ships ahead so that the Americans would be able to plausibly say that they had enough force to maintain the blockade, which is what it takes for it to be legal. He officially reinstated the blockade on November 12th, while he was still sailing towards Tripoli himself. By that time, the Philadelphia had already been captured. It had run aground on a reef in Tripoli harbor, and Bainbridge had surrendered after a very, very short engagement. When he found out about this capture, Preble lamented that this disaster would likely bring Tunis and Algiers into the war with the United States too, because they sensed weakness. But at least because of Preble's actions, Morocco was at peace. By the way, Tunis and Algiers did not ultimately come into the war. Preble learned about this capture in late November. Along with the news of the crew being made prisoner, which was bad enough, he learned some further bad news. The Tripolitans had been able to refloat the frigate off of the reef that it had grounded on and move it into Tripoli harbor. So now Preble had a lot of choices to make about how to deal with this problem. He didn't have confidence that the prisoners would be treated as proper prisoners of war, and he had to worry that the Bashaw would exact retribution on the prisoners for any sort of aggressive action he might take. But he had to take his chances. He had to come up with a way to do something about the Philadelphia and get it away from the Tripolitans. And that leads us to lesson number 3. Choose the right team. Some background information here. On December 23rd, 1803, as I mentioned already, the squadron got an unexpected gift. The USS Enterprise, under Lieutenant Stephen Decatur, this is him right here, captured a small Ottoman ketch named the Mastico. Preble initially planned to release the Mastico because it was neutral, it was Ottoman, but the Constitution's pilot, a man named Salvatore Catalano, told him that he knew that this very ketch had flown Tripolitan colors in a past life. And worse than that, under Tripolitan colors, the Mastico had participated in the capture of the Philadelphia. Wow, that changes everything. Preble immediately declared the ketch to be good prize and brought it into the fleet as the Intrepid. A few weeks later, several people had the idea to destroy the Philadelphia almost simultaneously, it seems like. Commodore Edward Preble, who we've already met, the leader of the squadron, Lieutenant Stephen Decatur, who had command of the Enterprise, and Captain William Bainbridge, who was captive in Tripoli. However, only one of these men was a feasible choice to lead any kind of expedition in order to destroy the Philadelphia. It couldn't be Bainbridge for obvious reasons. He was in prison. It couldn't be Preble because he's the commander of the whole squadron and he can't risk going in and doing something incredibly dangerous like this. So that pretty much means it's got to be Decatur. Initially, there was some discussion about whether the ship could be refloated and sailed out of the harbor. But ultimately, the squadron's leaders decided that it was impossible to do that, or at least way, way too risky. So instead, they needed a way to destroy the frigate. They also agreed that simply shooting at the frigate wasn't actually going to accomplish anything. They would have to get up close. To do that, Decatur was going to need a ship and a team. Originally, Decatur wanted to use his own vessel, the USS Enterprise, but Preble overruled this idea because the Enterprise was, number one, way too conspicuous. It's pretty obvious that it's an American ship of war, and also Preble couldn't afford to lose another ship if something went awry during the expedition. So the Mastico was their salvation. It was the perfect vessel to slip into Tripoli harbor undetected because it looked Tripolitan. Moreover, the Sicilian pilot of the Constitution, Salvatore Catalano, agreed to come on the mission. Decatur assembled a team of about 75 men, 70 volunteers of officers and men from ships throughout the squadron, plus 5 midshipmen that Preble sent him from the Constitution. You may wonder how these midshipmen got selected. Unfortunately, there are no midshipmen here, so my story's not going to be as good, but I'm still going to tell it. So I have to tell you a story about one of these midshipmen who did not end up going on the mission. He is one of my favorite people in this whole story. His name is Henry Wadsworth, and according to his own account, he was hand-selected by Commodore Preble to join Decatur's mission, and he was so excited about this appointment. However, he wrote in dejection in his journal a few weeks after the mission that he had not been able to go because he had fallen sick and he had taken to his bed and had to stay there for weeks, so he didn't get to go. Wadsworth in his journal does not reveal the nature of his sickness, but the logbook of the Constitution, recorded by Nathaniel Harridan, the sailing master, did. He tells us that Wadsworth was one of a few men on the sick list with a venereal disease. So take from that the lesson that you will. The men who volunteered were told nothing about this mission, hi Gillen, except that it was a secret expedition. But surely they must have had some idea that whatever they were doing, it was going to be about the Philadelphia. The Intrepid set off for Tripoli on February 3rd, 1804. It sailed along with the Siren, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Stewart. Preble had learned this lesson already. Don't send ships to Tripoli unaccompanied. Even if the last and most dangerous part of the mission had to be done alone, at least the Intrepid would have some backup if something went wrong. The two ships arrived off Tripoli on February 8th. By then, of course, the men had been informed of their actual specific mission, and they were very eager to fight. But a key member of the team told Decatur that it would be foolish to attack now. The weather was bad, the surf was high. The Sicilian pilot, Catalano, advised Decatur and his second-in-command, Charles Morris, that it would be their doom. If they went to Tripoli now, they would never come out. Most of the men on this mission grumbled at Catalano. They thought he was just a coward. But I have to tell you, if he was a coward about the weather and the surf, it was because he had sailed these waters many times, way more times than any of the Americans, and he knew what they were getting themselves into. Decatur knew the area a little bit. This is a chart that belongs to him of the Tripoli area, again, held by our own Naval Academy Museum, but he wasn't intimately familiar with this area in a way that a commercial pilot who had sailed these waters many times would have been. So Decatur and Morris, wisely, I think, opted to heed Catalano's counsel, and they waited. It was a good thing they did. The storm that had been brewing sprung up in earnest over the next day. The winds battered the ships incessantly and brutally. They began taking on water. The crew were miserable with seasickness and cold, but at least they weren't breaking up against the rocks of Tripoli Harbor, which is what they would have been doing if they had gone in when they had wanted to. Preble, initially, and Decatur, secondarily, had chosen the right advisor for this team. Catalano's value only increased as the weather settled and the crew began to make preparations in earnest for the assault. The plan was to make the Intrepid look as innocent as possible, innocent enough that they could sail right up next to the Philadelphia and tie onto it. The ketch is Tripolitan, so it looks pretty close, rigged in the traditional Tripolitan manner, so that should be easy enough. But it's the last 50 feet that are going to be the real problem. How were these intrepid sailors going to communicate with the 30 or so guards on board the Philadelphia that they were harmless and really just wanted to tie up, no ulterior motive whatsoever? None of the Americans spoke any of the local languages, and English probably would have been a dead giveaway. But Catalano did speak those languages. He definitely spoke Italian, he probably spoke Maltese, and most importantly, he spoke Arabic. When the Intrepid limped into the harbor on the evening of February 16th, Catalano shouted out in Arabic to the guards, "The ketch had lost its anchors in the gale. Could they tie up with the Philadelphia?" There were only a few other sailors on board the deck of the Intrepid. They were all dressed like Maltese sailors. Everyone else was down below waiting to see if this ruse was actually going to work. And it did. The Philadelphia guards sent out a boat to get the lines from the Intrepid to allow it to tie up next to the frigate, and the two crews hauled on the lines and brought the Intrepid right up next to the Philadelphia. The ketch was only a few yards away when the guards realized they'd been had. The alarm went up, but it was too late. The Intrepid's crew swarmed over the sides, overcame the guards, and set the ship ablaze. I'm sure there's more we could say about the individual bravery of each member of the handpicked team that Decatur selected. Several of the officers went on to command with honor later in this war and then later in their careers, and no doubt for the rest of their lives they were always able to use to their advantage the fact that they had been selected to burn the Philadelphia. But this is the lesson: choose the right team. And that brings us to lesson number 4. Maintain the rest of the mission. I'm sure there was not an officer in the squadron who didn't feel at least a little bit of envy that Stephen Decatur got picked to lead this mission and they didn't. There were many young officers who had shown great zeal during this war, and actually Decatur had not particularly distinguished himself thus far. But this daring expedition was only one part of the mission. The other part was keeping the blockade intact. From a strategic standpoint, the blockade was much, much more important than the burning of the Philadelphia. Burning the Philadelphia might win a few hearts, but enforcing the blockade might win the war. I could talk about several of the officers whose choices supported the mission during the period when the Intrepid was sailing for Tripoli, but I want to talk about just one, Lieutenant Richard Summers. Summers was the commander of the USS Nautilus. Not that Nautilus. Think how different this war would have been if there had been a nuclear submarine there. Very different. Not that one. This is a schooner, one of the small vessels that Bainbridge had advised to be part of the fleet. Summers was ordered to maintain the blockade off Tripoli as though nothing else were going on. On February 16th, the very night that the Philadelphia burned, Summers caught something sailing into Tripoli harbor, a vessel named the Santissimo Crocifesso. In fact, Summers could see the flames coming off the Philadelphia as he made this capture. This vessel had a very interesting backstory. It was a Maltese vessel, flying the British colors because Britain claimed Malta. This is the port of Malta. This is the garrison at Malta. It was carrying hemp, nails, linen, and 7 Tripolitan people. When it was captured, its master came up with a lot of really good reasons that it was not a good prize. His first argument was that the vessel was actually bound for Jerba, a port in Tunis, but it had been blown off course by the gale, the very same gale that had almost blown the Siren and the Intrepid away. Therefore, it wasn't trying to run the blockade because it wasn't going to Tripoli at all, and thus the materials on board were not contraband. There were a few small problems with this story. Number one, the Crocifesso had no papers indicating that its port of entry was going to be Jerba, and it did have those 7 Tripolitans on board. Number two, Summers found letters squirreled away in the ceiling of the master's cabin that were clearly bound for Tripoli. No shady business hiding letters in your ceiling. And most damning, Summers found that this vessel carried a passport of safe passage from Commodore Edward Preble. Now, how could that be damning? Edward Preble's the Commodore of the American Squadron. Why would Preble have given safe conduct to a ship bound into Tripoli when he had very adamantly declared that the blockade was absolute? Well, here's where we need to talk about cows. Yes, cows. I can see the looks on your faces. You're like, what are we doing here? Cows. Let's talk about cows. You see, the American squadron had been using Malta as a sort of headquarters for most of the war. Even though Preble had moved the official headquarters over to Syracuse, the United States still continued to use Malta as a vital resupply port. So the Americans had forged very strong ties with the Maltese governor, who was British. His name was Sir Alexander Ball. Ball was responsible for the feeding and care of both the people of Malta and the British garrison at Malta. This was a really difficult task. There wasn't much food available on the island of Malta itself, certainly not enough to feed all the mouths. Before the Peace of Amiens in 1802, there had been months and even years where Malta was very near starvation. Ball had to bring food from off the island, mostly from places all around the Mediterranean. So he had been bringing wheat and other grains from the Black Sea region, but it had proved difficult to get meat from that region, so he turned to other places to acquire meat, mostly the Italian states and the Barbary states. As early as 1800, Ball formed an agreement with some of the Barbary states to supply the Maltese garrison with cows. He didn't exclusively get them from Tripoli. Tunis was also a supplier, but for whatever reason, Tripoli was a very attractive trading partner. The cows from Barbary were certainly cheaper than the cows from Italy, even though they were also a little smaller. When the United States instituted the blockade of Tripoli in 1801, however, the cow trade had to stop. Ball asked the Commodore, Richard Dale, if he would grant an exception for cattle, and Dale said no. However, under the leadership of the second Commodore, Richard Valentine Morris, the blockade lapsed completely, as we've mentioned. For close to a year, ships came and went essentially with impunity, and among those were some cow ships. When Preble reinstituted the blockade in November 1803, there were still 1,000 cows in Tripoli that had been bought and paid for by the British, but they had not yet made their way back to Malta. Ball asked Preble if he would be willing to, one time only, allow those cows to be brought to Malta since they'd already been bought, they'd already been paid for. And Preble agreed, because he knew how important that relationship with the British was. He issued passports of safe conduct for 2 ships to bring the cattle from Tripoli to Malta, but with stipulations. Each ship had to travel from Malta to Tripoli in ballast. In other words, no commercial cargo, not hemp, or nails, or linen, or Tripolitan passengers, or anything like that. They had to pick up the cows in Tripoli, and then they had to return right back to Malta immediately with no other stop along the way. And all of this had to be completed by March 1st, 1804. Maybe you've already detected the problem. The Santissimo Crocifesso had Preble's passport, yes, but it also had cargo and passengers. In other words, it violated the terms of Preble's passport pretty obviously. Preble told his Navy agent in Malta, "Of course she is good prize." And Lieutenant Summers definitely knew that too. What Summers didn't know was that the capture of the Santissimo Crocifesso helped not only the blockade, the larger mission, but it actually helped the Philadelphia mission too. The British consul in Tripoli, Brian McDonough, was expecting the Crocifesso to arrive to pick up the cows. But the vessel never made it because Summers captured it before it got there. However, there was a vessel that entered Tripoli harbor on February 16th, 1804, and it was flying British colors. McDonough assumed that it was the cow ship, and he raised the British flag from the consular house in response, in welcome. That vessel was the Intrepid, and Catalano told the guards that it was sent from Malta to get the cows. Since the British consul had recognized the vessel from the consular house, the guards had validation that Catalano's story was true. So in Summers' attendance to his duty, in his zeal to maintain the rest of the mission, he actually ended up supporting both the secret expedition and the larger goals of the Navy in the Mediterranean. You may have heard that Lord Nelson called the burning of the Philadelphia the most bold and daring act of the age. He probably didn't actually say that. We don't have any proof anyway, but it sounds cool, so that's fine. And it certainly was a very bold and daring act. Not lying about that at all. Not just anybody could have acted under pressure in the way that Stephen Decatur did to pull off this mission. But there were many, many other actors, many other decision makers in this story too, and their decisions are no less important. If any one of the people in the tale that I've told today had chosen to act differently, this bold and daring act would not have happened. Throughout the war, we see again and again the value of learning from people who have experience, knowing who your enemy is, picking the right team, and maintaining the mission. But I want to leave you with one final thought. No one act, no matter how bold and daring, wins a war. In the case of the Philadelphia, it didn't even change the war materially. All the Americans got from the burning was nothing. Stephen Decatur got a promotion, good for him. He became the youngest captain ever in the history of the Navy, a distinction he still holds today. But the Navy didn't get the Philadelphia back. They didn't get the release of any of the prisoners of the Philadelphia. In fact, for a time after the burning, they were actually more mistreated. Tripoli was no more vulnerable to American attacks than before. Nothing changed. Except that the burning of the Philadelphia galvanized the Navy to keep fighting. To me, hey, join the Navy, we burn our own ships, isn't the best recruiting tool, but it did work. The Americans thought this act would bring the Bashaw closer to peace. They thought that the momentum had swung in their direction at last. It hadn't, but they didn't know that at the time. Several of the names I've mentioned here, and a few others who were also involved in the burning of the Philadelphia, also appear on the Tripoli monument, which you can't see right now because it's behind a construction fence. None of these men died on February 16th. No Americans died on February 16th. But all of these men died by the end of 1804. These men and their comrades kept fighting until another act turned the tide, at least a little bit, for a little while. And another act, and another act, and another act, until finally it was enough. The Bashaw came to terms with the Americans on June 10th, 1805, after that fabled march across the shores of Tripoli. Now, that wasn't the end of the story either, but that's probably a tale for another time. So I will close with that. Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to take your questions. Yeah, Ernie.
Yeah, fascinating discussion. Is there any context for that Lord Nelson quote? Because I wonder, it's just sort of Alfred quote.
It is. As far as I know, I have no idea when it became like attributed to him. As far as I know, no person ever said that, so it wasn't like a misattributed quote or anything.
Sort of sign.
It just feels like the kind of thing he might say.
It wasn't taken from a book he wrote about.
No, not as far as I know. No, actually, strangely, Lord Nelson talks almost not at all about the Americans ever.
Right.
So, if he had said this, that probably would have been a really big deal. Yeah. Yeah. Did I see another hand? I thought
Anything unusual about the escape after they sent the charges off?
Nope, they got away absolutely clean. Yeah. The alarm was sounded, they overcame all the guards, and so everybody had to come from the shore to try to fix it, but by that point there was nothing that could be done. There was a slight concern actually that the heat change from the amount of flame actually was going to suck the Intrepid back into the ship. Did not happen, thankfully, but it could have. Yeah.
Did the Tripolitans ever use the Philadelphia against the Americans, or was
They
there
didn't.
any indication they had the wherewithal and I mean, just that most of their ships were
Yeah.
relatively small?
No, that's a
to-
great
to
question.
crew it up?
It's a great question. The Tripolitans, this would have been the biggest ship in the Tripolitan fleet if they'd been able to use it by a huge margin. I don't remember the exact proportion, but like a lot more guns. It's not unheard of for a Barbary state to have a vessel of this size. The Americans actually built a frigate of about this size for Algiers, the Crescent, but the Tripolitans did not have a ton of experience sailing this big of a ship, and there was no indication that the Bashaw ever intended to arm it himself. There were sort of rumors that he might sell it to Tunis, and they might do something with it, but it does not seem likely to me that Tripoli would ever have actually been able to use the ship themselves.
Great talk, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah, Mike.
So just so I understand, the Americans wound up grounding the Philadelphia on a reef,
They did, right.
and then the Tripolitans managed to refloat it and then grounded it again in the harbor?
No, it was fully functional in the harbor. Hmm.
So it was
Yeah.
floating freely?
It was floating freely.
Okay.
Hmm. Yeah. So if they'd had enough men, they could have sailed it away, but Tripolitans didn't really have experience sailing that big of a ship, and it was too close in for the Americans to be able to get men onto it, do all the sail configuration that needed to be done, and get it all out before they got, shot at by the shore. So that's why they decided to burn it. Yeah, Ernie.
Another one. Do we know anything about the crew of the Intrepid, who the men were, or
We do.
just maybe shine a little bit of light of that? Such light is shineable.
Yeah, so it was a completely volunteer force, if accounts from the time can be believed, which you never know about these things. Pretty much everybody in the entire squadron volunteered, and Stephen Decatur had to pick people individually. However, the 5 midshipmen from the Constitution, those were picked by Preble, so not Henry Wadsworth, but some of his colleagues, midshipmen. And then the other ones, he picked some of his close friends to be his officers. So Charles Morris was a close friend of his, the person who's kind of acting as his first lieutenant. And then there's a list of names. We don't know much about the enlisted sailors in terms of their individual stories, but there certainly were people who really did sort of never have to buy another drink in their lives after this. The enlisted guys who would go back and say, I was part of the crew that burned the Philadelphia, and people are buying them drinks. So they might not have been particularly remarkable at the time, but this event did change their lives.
But it's also probably before they got into awarding medals to people.
Yeah, there was no medals awarded. Stephen Decatur does get a sword and a commendation from Congress in addition to getting he leapfrogged a few people on the captain's list, or to get onto the captain's list, which made a few people unhappy, but yeah, he did. But even he, his wife, after he was killed in a duel in 1820, his wife tried to get more out of the government than he had been given because she thought they had stiffed him.
So the Decatur on the plaque at the Naval Camp is a different Decatur?
No. So there are two Decaturs. There's actually this guy, James Decatur.
Yeah.
That's James Decatur. That's his younger brother.
Right, okay.
So Summers and all of these guys die in about 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks, in the fall of 1804. Everybody on this plaque. James Decatur is his younger brother, and Preble mounts this gunboat offensive at the end of August, or end of July and middle of August. And there's a big gunboat battle at the end of August, and James Decatur, Lieutenant James Decatur, is one of the captains of the gunboats, and he is killed after he captures a Tripolitan gunboat, and then the captain sort of reneges on his surrender and comes and hacks him up or something, kills him somehow. I think there's a sword involved. And so then this is where Stephen Decatur gets a little more even like legendary status. So Stephen Decatur sees that James, his younger brother, has been killed, and he like claws his way over to that gunboat and grapples in hand-to-hand combat with this Tripolitan captain and kills him. So yeah, this is like another jewel in his crown for the year 1804. But yes, so this is James Decatur. Yeah.
So afterwards, like you were saying, I mean, Stephen Decatur is seen as like a large.
The guy,
I mean,
yeah.
I was thinking of I learned about this not too long ago, but is there a modern day equivalent to Stephen Decatur's fame?
Oh.
I was thinking maybe like an Audie Murphy type, perhaps. Still a long time ago.
Honestly, I don't think so. And the reason I say that is that the way fame works now is very different from the way it worked back then. So we don't really have people that we hold up as being completely larger than life, and we just let them be larger than life. Like in the modern day, somebody would milkshake duck Stephen Decatur. It would definitely happen that somebody would be like, okay, he did all that awesome thing, but did you know that he might have actually killed some of the guards instead of taking them prisoner on the Philadelphia, which did possibly happen, not clear. Fred Liner thinks they did, it's hard to tell. That would have possibly ruined his reputation, but he also has the extreme benefit, unfortunately, of getting killed in a duel, which actually lionizes you even more, even though he was killed by a disgruntled fellow naval officer, James Barron. So it's, just the legend builds. You can't really get any further than that. Actually, in terms of that sort of thinking, potentially an analog might be John F. Kennedy, in that he was killed so young that there was not really a sense during his life of like, okay, where's this guy gonna go? And we're never gonna find out. So lots of good stuff happened, or lots of things that people really liked, and then it feels like somebody's life has been cut short. So Decatur was 45 or something like that when he got killed. So that might be sort of an analog of like how the fame grows for Decatur. But certainly he takes on this just absolute like godlike status that very few other people have had. Definitely not in the modern era. Yeah, Michael.
So it seems like the Intrepid is sort of, disguising itself, so to speak. It's not flying its colors.
Correct.
Is that an issue for anyone at the time, or is this considered an irregular warfare type situation, in which case that's not seen as
good question. It's actually not problematic even in a regular warfare situation. So you're always permitted to fly someone else's flag right up until you open your gun ports. Once you open your gun ports, you better be raising your own flag. But right up until that point, it is absolutely within the law of the sea, the laws of war, to practice that kind of deception. So it would have been very unremarkable. This would definitely not have raised anybody's hackles whatsoever. Yeah, Jackson.
So this Sicilian pilot.
Yeah.
Can you say any more about how he was hired or selected? Is there any more that you know about his past or his future?
I don't know a ton about him. There probably is more to know about him. But he was Sicilian, which means he was almost definitely hired when Preble moved the fleet to Syracuse. And he definitely does seem like the kind of guy who understands which side his bread is buttered on in a lot of ways. He tells Preble what he wants to hear about certain things. He sings like a canary about the Intrepid, or the Mastico at the time, its actions in Tripoli, because he knows that's something Preble wants to know about. He defends himself very vociferously after the fact, after the burning of the Philadelphia, when these charges of like cowardice or whatever come out. He, I think, rightfully says there's a difference between cowardice and wisdom and being smart about where you are. But I don't personally know a ton more about him. He's sort of a shadow figure in a lot of ways, which there are a number of those in this whole war. So no, I'm sure somebody probably knows more about him, but I don't. I thought I saw another hand. Did I see another hand? Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and we intend to do another one of these in November. Look for those email, I believe it's Monday before Thanksgiving, with a speaker from Naval War College, Dr. Evan Wilson. So, thank you, and we'll see you next time.